Welcome, everyone, for another episode of DC Thursday. I'm Pete Soderling. I'm the founder of Data Council and the Data Community Fund, and we're excited that you join us almost every Thursday as we chat with a leader of a company, open source project, or tool in the data ecosystem. And today we're very fortunate to have Boris Jabes, who is from Census. And Boris, I think I just said your name wrong, even though we discussed it. So it's Jabes, Boris Jabes. We
That's right.
aim to please here at DC Thursday. So even if it means repeating things on the air and showing a healthy dose of humility, that's something that is in line with our values. So Boris, thank you for joining us and for your patience with the name. We're really happy that you're here today to talk to us.
I'm very happy to be here, man. Pete, it's great to do this.
So Boris, you have a pretty interesting background. You started a company before. It was Meldium that you sold to LogMeIn. And before that, you were a senior PM at Microsoft.
Yeah.
So I want to keep those things in context because usually as we traverse your experience in your career, we find that these things sort of stack up to pointing you to where you're at today. And so
Sure.
I like to keep it in mind. But I wanted to start off and ask you, you went through Y Combinator. And so I was curious to hear a little bit more about that experience. Obviously, it was a company before Census. I believe it was Meldium that you took through YC. Is that right?
That's right.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about that experience and what it was like as an engineer, going through the startup accelerator like that.
Yeah. It was. It almost feels like a different time in the Valley. This was in 2013. Y Combinator, for people who know, is now a much larger organization. I think there are roughly like 400 companies, I think, that go through YC a year now, maybe 500. And we were a batch of 40 companies going through YC at the time. It's a really amazing experience, is my short answer, for a couple of reasons. One is, as with any great kind of organization, you're around a great cohort of people. And so it's not just that Paul Graham was an amazing kind of mentor for startups and could really help you think through your ideas and how to build something kind of big, but you're also around unbelievably ambitious founders. So I think the two things I got from YC is the first, which is in the name, right? Y Combinator it's not going to make your company. It's not going to incubate it, right? To use that term. It really is about accelerating you on the path that you're on. And they do that mostly by helping you focus on the things that matter, right? Which is mostly, the short answer on this is like focusing on growth and focusing on the derivative rather than everything else. And that's a very, very useful thing when you're a first time founder, because it's easy to either not know what to do at all or to try to adopt all the things you were doing as an employee of a company where you know how to build software, but you're not, you don't realize like what changes you have to make when you're out in the open building a company. Like you have to make a lot more sacrifices and focus on a lot less things because you don't have the bandwidth to do everything. And then the other thing that I got from Y Combinator that I think is underappreciated and maybe it doesn't get talked about as much, it's really like an ambition boost. Paul Graham especially was really good at taking any idea that people had and seeing it in a bigger way than any of the founders did. So Meldium was an identity management product, right? It was a single sign-on product. So for people who know Okta, it was kind of like that, but much more focused on passwords and kind of helping teams and companies use SaaS products seamlessly, so you didn't have to deal with password management as a team. And you can think of it as nowadays for people, it'd be like somewhere between like a cross between 1Password and Okta. Think of like a marriage of those two things. And it was a little bit ahead of its time. And we had some ambitions that we felt this was a great idea and needed to exist in the world, but he took it to like, you will have every password in the universe, right? Like this is amazing. Like you could, and so he helps you think of the maximal version of your product and your company, and that's very, very empowering, right? Because you have to be able to kind of struggle through really tough times as you build your company. So I think those are probably the things I remember the most about YC. And then, like I said, your cohort is just excellent. I've made, you make amazing friends who are all, just brilliant and ambitious.
Mm-hmm. And you've spoken before, I think, about how your foray into the auth identity world and that part of infrastructure somehow prepared you for the what you call the flip side of the coin and thinking about the data world. What's the relationship between the two, and how did you get from one to the other?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of founders start with some pain they've experienced themselves, right? So if I could, the backstory here would be, the best way to think about it is, when we started our first company, we wanted to use all the SaaS products that were coming out back in 2012. Whether that's Google Apps, GitHub. Nowadays there's thousands, right? But it was new. It was like you really wanted to be able to use these great apps. And there was this chaos that came out of that because you had to manage employee passwords in every single system. It was really frustrating. And so we built a seamless tool to be able to kind of manage a team, log in seamlessly, and be able to, kind of have all the control and the comfort of, not having to worry about access management. But as a user, the upside is I could use any piece of software I wanted to, and I was not limited by the set of software that my IT team gave me. And the analogy I give for this is, when SaaS emerged, there were two pieces of the kind of computer operating system that were forgotten. So when you have a computer and you install apps, right, going back into the 80s and 90s, you would log into your computer and not into Photoshop, right? And you would have a file system on your computer and not in Photoshop. And those two things were missing in SaaS. And so Meldium was an attempt to create a central federated authentication system so that every SaaS app could avoid having to build that. And I would say that Okta is evidence of kind of how that grew into a massive market and massive business. And Census, when I say the flip side of the coin, is trying to do the same thing for the rest of your data. Instead of employee identity, it's like your customer data, which in a way is yours as a company, but you want it federated to every possible SaaS app that you're using. And in order to use the maximum number of SaaS apps in the world, you want to have a great federation system for that. And so that's how Census was born, as like, the flip side of that coin. And so a lot of what I learned building Meldium, kind of applies here, even though authentication and IT are very different from data and data tooling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's this notion of federation plus sort of consumption by third-party systems that seems to be a guiding principle for you.
That was very much at the root. Yeah, that was very much at the root of the idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to be an interesting conversation, because you're playing really in what many consider to be a new category of data, the data ecosystem. And essentially what we're talking about today, through our chat, is this area to the right of the data warehouse. Yeah. And it seems to me that, when I met you and Sean, your co-founder, like early on, several years ago, and Sean was telling me about this tool that was piping data, from a database or a data warehouse, like back into business tools for salespeople. It wasn't even necessarily obvious that you necessarily were a piece of data infrastructure per se, or weren't necessarily thinking of it like that. I kind of want to get your thoughts on that, because it seems like it wasn't obvious even to you and the team that this was essentially could become a data infrastructure company. Like, how are you thinking of it at the time?
That's very true. And yeah, you have the unique advantage of having met Census very early in its life. So Census started in 2018, and the core first version of the product is still the product, which was this bridge between a data warehouse and this application, Salesforce being the very first one, unsurprisingly. And you're absolutely right that when we built that and we were out looking for our first couple of customers, we knew this was useful because we had felt this pain, in particular, actually, after we sold Meldium to this larger kind of public company called LogMeIn, the sales and marketing teams were completely separated and disjointed from our team, and we had all this amazing product data. So we knew there was a disconnect there, like we needed a bridge built. The question is, who's going to drive that, right? Who's going to install it and manage it? And even though it's physically connected to the data warehouse, it wasn't obvious back in 2018 that data organizations would want to touch this, right? Because historically, this was not in their purview, right? Historically, I think a data team owns the data infrastructure, but not these business application scenarios. And so some of the early users of Census were on the edge of what you would call the data team. And they were basically business operations teams. And if you were to zoom in though, right, you would realize like these are effectively, at the very least, analysts. They just don't use the data title. And the further we kind of got users and fans back in 2018 and 2019, the more it became plausible and then obvious, basically one at a time, right? Plausible, then possible, then obvious, that data teams were the best custodians of this because it sits on the data infrastructure and it actually it magnifies the output of a data team, which is a very kind of attractive thing.
Well, on that note, why don't you tell us, just so that the audience have the benefit of understanding where you're coming from, why don't you tell us about what Census does? Because I think there's a lot to unpack in what you said, and I don't want our common sort of shared knowledge or previous conversations to leave everyone else in the dust. But I think what you mentioned was something to the effect that previously teams sort of thought that data stopped at the dashboard, right? Like the dashboard was the last place that data was consumed. And it sounds to me like you're talking about something that might go above and beyond that. Tell us more.
Yeah. So yeah, let's explain what Census the product is for the people who have no context like you. Census is a automated data pipeline product, right? It connects to a data warehouse and syndicates data out. It publishes data from a data warehouse into all the interesting business applications that companies use, whether that's sales tools, right? Salesforce, HubSpot, et cetera, support tools like Zendesk, Intercom, or finance tools like NetSuite. So it's about taking data and models and insights that live in a data warehouse and pushing them out seamlessly on a regular cadence so that the state that lives in your warehouse can be syndicated, right? Can be federated out to applications. So that's what Census does. And it was born, like I said, as this bridge between, hey, I want to get product data, product analytics, especially into my sales tool so that my sales team can target the right leads or better understand the users or drive upsells, et cetera. That was one of the very earliest of scenarios. And so implied in that, right, is the use cases that Census enables, which were completely new at the time. And like I said, in 2018, really, I don't think almost any data team was doing anything like this, was going far beyond a dashboard into action that sales, at first, like I said, sales teams, but eventually, marketing, finance, et cetera, are powered by Census. And what I mean by action is you're not showing them information in a dashboard. You're not even embedding analytics, which was kind of well-trodden ground, I think, by Tableau and tools like Looker already back then. We were saying, what if you could generate information in a third-party system and potentially mean that you're changing the behavior of the end user? So I'll give you the simplest of examples. A lot of our customers, right, are really kind of product-led companies. They have lots of freemium users. They have lots of users, period. And you really can't, it's a lot of work to sift through that to figure out who a salesperson should actually engage with. It's kind of, we kind of understand that. And there's a lot of amazing analytics to understand who high value users are. You can put that on a dashboard, but that doesn't change the fact that a salesperson has to wake up in the morning and decide, who am I calling today? Who am I talking to? And our customers use Census to take the scoring and insights they have on the users that are most likely to convert, and send that directly into the CRM as leads or objects or contacts or accounts, such that the salesperson will wake up and their task list will already be generated, and they can just do their work. They can just start making the calls, and that's very different than in terms of a relationship between a data team and their stakeholders of a dashboard, right? Because now it's actually my work list is just generated from this.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So in that use case, does Census have somewhat of a brain to be able to do the lead scoring as well, or to what extent does Census have business logic versus the business logic sort of remaining in the end tool, the CRM in this example?
Yeah, so I would say you see people, there's logic can live on either end of the, let's call it the bridge, right? So Census is this bridge between the warehouse and, let's say, your sales tool. Some folks choose to bring kind of well-modeled data into the CRM and let the CRM decide. So you might say, I want to bring in really precise information about how many users are in this organization, in this company, right? So take Figma, right? They have millions and millions of users, all these organizations. You could do, hey, let's sync exactly how many active users there are in every account. And then you can have a rule in Salesforce that says, if an account has more than X active users, they should be routed to this sales team where there's a round robin, assignment, and they will take the work, right? So there's definitely companies that do it that way. And then there are companies where I'll just say that the programming model for this in Salesforce can be frustrating for some people. And SQL and the warehouse is an amazing execution environment. So a lot of our customers actually kind of do it the other way, where they'll create those rules as just another layer in their modeling stack that can live in Census, right? Like we can execute arbitrary kind of anything your warehouse can execute, we can execute through Census. And they'll create those rules there. And by rules, I just mean yet another SQL transform, and then just send that across the wire. So some people treat their destination apps as slightly dumber terminals over the data that is in the warehouse, and some of them maintain kind of a lot of logic in the end system, but they still want the correct source data to come. And the only true arbiter of correct information is the data team in the data warehouse.
Got it. And like going back to the early days, what were some of the validation points that you discovered when you spoke to early customers? Like, how did you know that you were onto something? Again, back in 2018, like when it wasn't as clear perhaps as it is today.
Yeah. So I think like I said, a lot of startups I think are born this way. We built our first version because we knew we had experienced this pain, right? And so we felt, well, okay, what kinds of companies would resemble Meldium, right? Meldium was product-led, freemium, and had suddenly been assigned, external sales and marketing. So it was like, who might look like that? And we were very much builders, right? So instead of just, some people will go out with a PowerPoint and walk around town and see who would bite. And I really respect that. We, kind of just spent a month building kind of our first version of this thing. And we kind of took that around to some friends where we said, well, you theoretically should look like this. But it was much more of an exploration. And I think the first aha moment was in 2018, Figma was just about to go on a tear, and they had just hired their initial sales team, right? They had this massive adoption already, like self-service, but now they wanted to expand. And one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of companies, and this was, like I said, the first aha moment, is no one wants to end up in kind of what I call the Evernote trap, where you have a great freemium product and there's self-service, but you never figure out like the scaling in revenue all the way up to enterprise. And Figma knew this. And so they were starting around their Series B and investing in enterprise sales, but they wanted to create that funnel that goes from free to pro to enterprise. And they had, when they saw what we had built, they said, this is correct. This is the mindset that we have, because Salesforce is at the end of this, and the data and our data warehouse that they were using Redshift was where all their interesting product data lived. And they knew they wanted this to be powered off of that flow because most people were self-service. So the last thing you want to do is call people who have like just paid with their credit card. Like, why would you want to do that? So it was really, that was that first confirmation that we were doing the right thing. But of course, one customer is, that's enough to kind of tide you over for a bit. And then we just kind of, the first 10 customers that we got were very much in this vein. And they just kind of increasingly confirmed that, hey, there's a need here. And then I started noticing kind of changes in behavior that really kind of told me that things were going to get interesting.
So I just wanted to clarify one thing you said, because you mentioned that it sounded like you wanted to sell to other customers that had the mentality that Meldium had, meaning product-led, bottoms up. And that was just because that was your view of the world as a founder, like you believed in that go-to-market motion, and you wanted to build some tool for other companies who believed in a similar bottoms-up motion. Is that fair?
Yeah, I might even go slightly stronger in that the premise. Look, if you let's rewind, right? Every company since the dawn of companies has had customers and some form of customer data, whether that's a physical Rolodex somewhere, in a salesperson's hands, or cue cards or whatever, or a database. And Salesforce is the standard for the last 10 plus years, right? Like it's the database that, not that it's 100% of the market, but a huge percentage of companies have their customer data there. And the reason they do is that it's a great tool for tracking the work of salespeople. But my premise, which again was informed from Meldium, is if software is the thing that you're selling and growth is driven from the software, i.e. bottom up, product led, which seems obvious to people, I think, in the Valley, but not necessary. But if that's the case, then increasingly the locus of interesting information is not going to be coming from your sales team, but actually coming from the product. And so to me, it was who would already feel that way and could kind of agree and confirm that they would want the warehouse as the central brain rather than the CRM as the central brain. And that's where working with these kinds of companies became the right move. But yeah, not everyone was on that. People are at different stages of that journey, obviously.
Interesting. And how did your early experiences with these customers sort of uncover similar reactions that you've mentioned previously felt akin to folks sort of stepping into the DevOps movement? Like you felt like there was something really foundational about this model that was sort of a sea change with customers. Like talk to us about how that awareness dawned on you.
You brought this up at the beginning of since when we started, our first couple of users were not even what you would traditionally call a data team. They involved a lot more of these business operations teams. So what led us to where we are today? And I think there's a couple of things, and this is how you can make the final puzzle piece of my professional life, right? Because I spent the first half of my professional life in developer tools. I worked on Visual Studio at Microsoft and love developer tools. So my mind was always attuned to that as well. And what we saw was this. So our first couple users, started using Census as this ETL product. And they actually even started referring to it as a reverse ETL way back in, I think 2018 or 2019. And is it's a cute terminology, right? Because people are so used to tools like Fivetran that seamlessly bring your data down into the warehouse, and Census was seamlessly taking the data out of the warehouse, right? So they're like, hey, let's call that reverse ETL. And at first it's like augmenting, information that is in their destination tools, let's say like a Salesforce or a Zendesk. But as they started depending on it more and more and pushing more and more attributes, metrics, data, objects, et cetera, into these tools, the value goes up, right? They magnified the value of what was in their data warehouse, but they also kind of took on more and more responsibility. And this was the signal that was like, you have to manage this carefully. And you can't, I think historically, when you think of that, kind of way people do app integration, people are somewhat haphazard about it. They just connect a thing to a thing, and then they just connect another thing to another thing. And it's great. Hey, like when someone fills out our web form here, like put them into MailChimp. And it's like very easy, very practical. But you start to lose like, what is the state of the world, and is the data correct, and how do we recover from errors and all these things. And our customers, because these were such crucial systems to them, right? Like the entire sales process of Figma was being powered by Census, literally the entirety of it. And this is becoming pretty critical. So you have to start implicitly, you have to start thinking about your data the way people who make products think about products, i.e. versioning it, testing it, deploying it, etc. And this was new to them. In fact, it still is new to them because they're not engineers by let's call it by upbringing. And we've taught this for decades now in the software engineering world. First, when we were making software on disks, and then as we made web software, we developed like newer processes and newer tools, right? In the 2000s and 2010s of, DevOps. So whether that's all the way from, you're versioning your code, which is like obvious and has been in the industry for decades, to, having a pager and managing like a pager rotation using pager. And none of this really existed in the data world or in the business operations world. And so that is the larger kind of mission for Census, is to actually not just help people connect the data out and create this federation of data out of your data warehouse, but help you do that with confidence. And the way to do that is to kind of adopt what I call DevOps practices. And so I think we're just going to adapt this to data. So it's like, folks are now calling that, the data ops kind of ecosystem.
So just to make sure I understand, so what you're saying is that this is essentially sort of the stakes are much higher because we're getting data in an automated fashion from the data warehouse, which used to be the end of the ETL. Now it isn't anymore. We're getting it back into Salesforce. We're using it to automatically drive lead scoring lists or automated outreach or salesperson outreach or whatever. And so because the stakes are so high on this data that's being re-imported, just for an example, back to Salesforce, the customer has to trust the data. There has to be sort of quality assurances. There has to be SLAs, right? You have to know if the data gets stale. And so there's sort of this whole other end of the orchestration that's required in order for the business teams to really trust the automated data that's flowing back into their business systems.
Exactly. And that's, I think, and you've been watching the data world for a long time too. And I think this, we catalyzed, I would say, something that was like on its way to happening. But I think Census is, I think, a catalyst to investing in these, this kind of education, these kinds of tools, and these kinds of processes. So nowadays, everyone's talking about how you test your data, right? It's, one of the things that's great about dbt, for example, is like you can version your data models, but it's nice that you can also just test them right there, right? And that, I think 3 years ago was kind of neat, but not necessary. Because if your dashboard was wrong, what's the worst that happens, right? You might get at the end of the quarter, like an angry meeting, and then you'll fix the dashboard with the revenue, like you fix it, and then, okay, we're okay. But our customers, I'll give you a great example. One of our earliest customers was Clearbit. This is way back. And they were, their first integration, although they integrate with a lot of different things, was to their email marketing tool. And before Census, they had lots of different systems writing data into the email marketing tool. And there were lots of duplicates. I'm talking like they would send an email and sometimes the person would get it 7 times. And in the warehouse, they could, the data analyst could, that uses Census, was able to kind of deduplicate, build the correct, kind of, let's call it master list of users with the correct set of attributes, and basically overwrote the email marketing tool completely from scratch and seamlessly switched over to the correct data set. And from that point forward, the emails were great. However, and this is the, what's the line from Spider-Man? Like, with great power comes, great responsibility. What was net new to her, which had not been the case for her ever before, is if you make a change to the data model now, the effect is like you're playing with live ammo, because this is automated emails are going out. Mm-hmm. So if you screw up the data model just accidentally, mm-hmm. Millions of people might get an email within hours. Mm-hmm. And so that creates fear. And to me, this was maybe the most, I felt really bad in a way for our user, but actually this was a sign that we were doing something very important, because empowerment like means you have more responsibility, which means you have, you are going to be more afraid to screw up, right? And you have to have, then your tools have to help you and give you the confidence. And so we started investing heavily at that point in validating your data before it goes out and catching all sorts of failures before they could happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of, people at first will see Census as like a really easy way to push a metric from your data warehouse into, take your pick, right? Zendesk or Salesforce or whatever. Mm-hmm. But the real value is it helps you do that while giving you the confidence that you're not going to screw up. And that's what you realize after a little bit of using it. And that also means you're working on something important, right? Because I ultimately think products are about empowering people, and you've empowered people when they're more afraid.
Yeah, if you realize your tool has that much leverage and power, sort of where it's sitting in the value chain, that's definitely indicative of something good.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've kind of danced around it, but I just wanted to give you a chance to sound off on your views on operational analytics. I mean, we basically sort of talked all around this concept, but
yeah,
that's a term that you've preferred to use, I know, in the past. And it seems like, if there was a banner that sort of goes over this whole conversation that we've had so far, it's really the fact that businesses need to start to think about data in terms of the operational power it can give to their business versus just sort of being a function that stops at a BI tool in a dashboard somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice name because we work with analysts, we work with analytics teams, we work with data teams, and the whole point of Census, if you haven't already bought into it, is everything that you do in a dashboard, all the data modeling you do, all that interesting insight you generate, whether that's through ML, data science, you name it, would be more powerful if it was pushed into systems where people are taking action, i.e. operationalized. Right? It was put into the way the business is run rather than the way the business is informed, right? Which is what a dashboard does. And don't get me wrong, like BI was a significant step forward in the last 20 years of now a lot of companies have great data when they make strategic decisions. But to me, that's not really data driven, right? That's not data powered. That's just informed by data, which is great. But the Census difference is operationalize those analytics, like those the output of your data team, rather than even just like the raw data. So that's why we use this term operational analytics. Even though it's very long, I guess we should probably get a 18 in there somewhere. But I think it really summarizes the shift. And the interesting thing is, it's not just that you should think about how to use your data, like the fact that you should push it out to more than a dashboard, more than a BI tool, which is, the first hump, right? It's like, if we can help you realize that there's more you can do with your analytics, that's great. And then, like I said, that becomes a catalyst for investing in your data team and in the core, right? Which I think is actually the real job to be done of data teams, is building a foundation so that the entire company can depend on the data organization. And that's new. As a BI team, you are, like you said, you're a sink, right? You're the final stage, not just as a piece of software in the data warehouse in the BI tool, but actually as a team as well. You're like a leaf node. And with Census and kind of this broader operational analytics approach, you're no longer, right? Now you have dependence at a like software level. And so you have to reorganize your team, and you also have to kind of reorganize your logic, your data.
Well, let's drill into that a little bit more, because I know there's some significant challenges in philosophy and values and just mentality. If a data team were to sort of expand some of their purview and start to be responsible for this kind of data that flows back into business systems, like how do you think the culture, the mentality of a team has to change? How should they think of themselves sort of in this new era? What does this mean for a data team?
Yeah, I think this is a deep vein, and there's a lot. I think we're in the midst of like a really fun shift and transformation here anyway. And so I've got very strong opinions that will probably not all pan out to be true, but I think they're worth putting into the world. So I think you have to make two kinds of shifts as you expand the footprint of your data team. The first is actually technical, which is you can't, if all you build is reports, I think there's a tendency to just take data that's just, hey, you'll drop some data into a warehouse, you'll run like a report and like generate the visual. And we know, right? Like we already know that if you're going to have to build one report, you could just do that. If you're going to build 10, maybe you build one tiny abstraction. If you're going to build 100 or 1,000, obviously you have to build some reusable models. And that's the first shift. And I think we're still at the beginning of that. If you really look broadly at the whole world, I think the nerds have already adopted kind of best practices around here. Around like dbt has really exploded as a great tool for creating central models that you can version. But we're really at the very infancy of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of onus on the technical side, on the logical, like code side of what should those models look like such that they can be reused by reports, but also reused by these destination SaaS applications. And if I were to reframe to you what Census was trying to accomplish, and still is always trying to accomplish, is turn your data warehouse that you own into the central brain and the central data store for you and your company, and make every third-party SaaS app like a cache on that data. So you got to come up with the right data models for that. And we have a lot of patterns that we kind of help customers build here so that they can do this well. So that's, kind of one transformation. It's almost like at the pure technical level.
The technical side.
Yeah. And then there's the organizational side. And I think there is changes within and changes outside of your data team. So I think within, we're already starting to see this, but you have to kind of, a lot of people might say what the data team is just the data science team. And I think that's too small-minded, right? So you really have at least 3 types of people or 3 layers within your data organization. You've got the core data engineering team, which I think still will always exist, potentially building, like owning the low-level infrastructure, setting up the Snowflake, building certain kinds of pipelines. I think over time there's going to be a lot more purchasing rather than building in that environment, but there is always going to be some amount of software to be built. Then you have this analytics engineering layer of a team, right? That is focused on SQL, focused on the data models, but is about building reusable things. And then you've got what I'll call the tail of it, which is the data science and analysts who are finding insights, using that data, doing interesting things. And that's, I think not every company has decided that the data team is all of this combined. And the reason I know this is one of those people, at least one set of those people, are for sure engineers. And it is unusual for an engineer to report to a finance team, but most BI teams report to a finance team. So I think there's like within organizational change, right? So you should create one leader around all of those pieces, even if the data analysts are going to be loaned out to business teams, right? Which is totally reasonable. But I think you should have one center of excellence for this. And then you, from outside as the CEO, you kind of want to think about where does this sit so that it can provide maximal value to the business. And the whole point of operational analytics is that you don't just serve the finance team and the Wall Street side of with dashboards and revenue reports. You serve the sales team, the support team, the finance team, the product team, the the marketing team. There's so many teams that you serve through these centralized data models. So you actually have to reformat, where the organization sits and who it formally has as stakeholders. And in my mind, I actually think it should be a foundational piece of the company. I actually think the data team should be like a platform team for the whole company. I don't know anyone who does that yet, just to be clear. And I think for that to happen, you're going to need something that is akin to a chief data officer, or at least something that reports pretty closely to the CTO, almost certainly. And you're going to need to shift from IT thinking, which is, I think, where data has historically been, which is reactive to requests from various stakeholders, towards product thinking. And that's, I think, a really big shift.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems like that could be a conversation, IT thinking versus product thinking as an overlay on a data team. I think that's a new concept that could definitely be explored in a much deeper conversation, because I think there's a lot there.
Yeah. I mean, I think most people who listen, who have dealt with, are in data or have been around data, I mean, it's very classic to get questions, like, hey, can you fix this report? Can you build me a report? It's probably the most common thing. Can you answer this question for me? And we talk a lot about how do we make that self-service, which helps a little bit, but of course that also moves the burden of education to the edge nodes. But I think when I say product thinking, I actually mean that you don't just acquiesce to every request. You actually take that all in and decide on whether that's weekly, every other week, every month, doesn't matter. You create a cadence of shipping, and you take all that feedback in as the same way that a product, like the Census team, gets customer requests 24/7, right? And the law of software is you cannot ship everything. A, because you don't have bandwidth. B, because it doesn't always make sense, right? And you want a great product experience. And so the data team has to kind of take that on. And I actually think product managers should exist in every data organization, for example, whose job it is to manage the product that is the data. So communicating with stakeholders, reducing it down to what we're going to ship, and creating a cadence around that, and then sharing that with the whole company.
It's like the switch from the project manager, which basically like manages a project plan, to a product manager, which essentially like sort of manages a product roadmap. And so it's a much more strategic way of thinking about your data team's deliverables against product management guidelines versus just the project management, which is sort of typical in the IT-based world, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, right? Like, when you're doing hey, we got to roll out new access points for the Wi-Fi, right? Like that's very much a project. But here you're right. It's a roadmap of what's going to change in the tools and in the products. And by the way, it's not just that, right? I think a really good rule of thumb for people is, to go back to our earlier conversation about DevOps and data ops, is we devise those processes for a reason, because they're really well optimized for shipping software, shipping product at high velocity with high confidence. So you want to have versioning of your code. Why? So that you can rewind, right? So that you can collaborate, so that you can kind of branch, right? These are all the reasons we version our code. And that applies to high velocity data shipping as well, right? You want to be able to have staging environments so that you can test stuff out as you go out to production, right? You want to do that with data as well. You want to be able to have automated testing before data or code is deployed, right? And again, there are certain tools emerging to do that. And then you want to deploy, right? The same way you go to production in a software application. And Census is actually, that's a great way to think about Census. Census is a deployment tool, right? Because it deploys your data into all of the third-party systems that depend on it. And so we're there to kind of have your back, right? And prevent you from deploying bad data, which would be disastrous. And I think all of this is, just brand new processes that people are putting in place.
Yeah. So as you mentioned before, you would like to, your vision of the world is to see the data warehouse be the central brain of the organization, and all of the other third-party systems essentially have caches of that data. Is that the best way you can think about explaining your biggest vision for this area?
I think it's a good, I think we landed on a really good nerdy definition of it. So I like it. But yeah, I think the data warehouse is one of the greatest pieces of technology I think that's happened in the last, let's say 5 to 10 years, infinite scale of storage and compute. And it's just a much better platform for storing, your customer data and your core, kind of data that you care about as a company. I think it's important for companies to own their data. I think you should think about that as something that you manage and build out as a company. I think it's your core value, right? And I think you should be able to use any SaaS product to drive any business operation. Some of our customers have 300 SaaS applications that they use. So it's not just that I want those applications to be a cache. It's actually that I just want to empower companies to be able to build any operation, any automation using any SaaS product. And the way to do that is to have a product like Census there to federate that data out for you. And then, for me, the ultimately products are about people and about making them, like I said, the best versions of themselves. And so the goal, if we can turn data practitioners into some of the most powerful people in a company, some of the most leveraged people in a company, I will consider that a job well done. And we're nowhere near that today.
Yeah, got it. Well, I just, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what are your insights on this broader space? Like, what are you excited about sort of happening in the near future in this space? And also sort of in relation to that, what are some of the key insights that you've picked up as you've come this far and been involved in sort of the curation of this new category of tooling? Yeah.
So I think there's a lot that's exciting, right? And I'll give you one example, which is, to me, I'm excited by anything that it moves the kind of quality and capabilities of the core, which is, let's call it the warehouse and database technology itself. So the more you use Census, the more you operationalize your analytics, the more you realize that you're magnifying the value of your data. That's great. But bit by bit, you will realize that there are scenarios in which you want lower and lower latency. And to me, this is a really exciting kind of development in the data warehouse, and let's call it the grand merger of data lakes, data warehouses, and streaming, and all these various pieces that are coming together basically, and especially incremental materialized views are kind of like my favorite thing right now, that are getting our customers and people closer to be able to deliver data at lower latency, like fresh data, correct data at lower latency. And the more you can do that, the more you can turn on scenarios that are powering the business. So take a classic thing that a lot of our customers are doing. Companies like Notion and Figma are doing this every day in Census. They have scoring systems that run through Census, right? So they have SQL scoring systems that determine who is the most active users, how large of a team they are, all these kinds of signals that they aggregate into a score that says you are worthy. We should talk to you for a sales conversation. By the way, some of our customers use that in a different way, which is, I want to provide you different service on the support side. So they'll sync that data with a support tool to be able to prioritize tickets. It's a really cool kind of way of using the same piece of information. So you have this scoring system, and then you push that, you create leads, right, in your CRM, and then that generates work in a call. Well, sometimes the value of making that phone call within 24 hours versus within 1 hour versus within 15 minutes could be real. And so the more our data technology can get us to running the entirety of the data pipeline, including kind of the transformation layer, the ingestion layer, and the testing layer, all that in such a way that it can get you the answer and push it out in less time is super empowering. And so I think that's probably one of my favorite areas. So, companies like Materialize, I think, are really, really cool for getting people closer and closer to that worldview of like, hey, you just build models, they're incrementally materialized, it happens faster and faster. Someday, we'll get to sub-second, but like we're not there today, but like we'll get there. And I think that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, well, we haven't even talked about how Census might play in the streaming data world, but
Right.
Obviously, I think that could be very interesting going
Yes.
forward. Streaming obviously has to live up to its end of the bargain, and sort of become something that the world can really operationalize and take hold of without building infinitely complex systems. Such as streaming systems sometimes are.
Totally,
but
totally.
We'll
I'll give you
actually.
I'll give you. Yeah, we can't get into that fully, but I'll give you. You asked for like what's an insight, what's something I've seen, and one of the interesting pitfalls or mistakes I've seen people do is even way outside of core engineering, people are really addicted to the idea of events and activity streams. So marketers love that too. And what I found is people over-index on the value, like the cool things you get from event processing, and not enough on the downsides. So what I mean by that is it's absolutely necessary at high scale, kind of in high scale systems. So on the engineering side, of course, you're going to need at some point something like a stream processing system like a Kafka or whatever to manage messaging at scale and event processing at scale. But believe it or not, you see the same behavior without the same words on sales and marketing teams where they say, hey, every time someone hits the website, I just want the event, like they came to the website or they swiped a credit card or they did a thing. And one of the things I try to teach, because you can sync events, you can sync state, but Census really, I'm constantly trying to push people to realize that with the right tooling, which we've built, syncing state is actually in many cases better for you than syncing the events. And I have found that business teams, because they're not versed in the, kind of, let's call it the computer science of like event-based thinking versus state-based thinking. It's actually a lesson that takes them a while to learn. And the reason is like, at first it seems great. Hey, every time, user added to org, I just want the event, user added to org. But if you don't know how to aggregate the data in your marketing tool to realize that people get deleted from orgs and that you actually have to maintain that logic at every layer of the system versus putting that in your warehouse, putting that in the central brain and having a tool like Census just sync the ultimate value. So, hey, there are now 12 users according to, the aggregation math that we have. And Census will make that true everywhere. We'll say it's 12 everywhere. Don't worry about it. And that is the correctness that you get from that is so much more valuable, in my opinion, than the immediacy you get from user got added, right?
Playing with state,
and this
events,
is something that people don't really see. Yeah, so that's I'll give you that. That's a kind of insight that I've seen people struggle with, and they don't know why, because it's somewhat difficult. It's like kind of distributed systems kind of thinking you have to have.
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight, and that makes perfect sense. Well, Boris, it's been great to have you, share with us today. Thanks for taking time to share all your learnings and experiences in the data ecosystem. I'm curious, how can folks get a hold of you if they want to be in touch?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this with anyone. So I'll give them my email. It's like boris@getcensus.com. And I'm sure we'll put that in the show notes somewhere. And people feel free to cold email me. I'd love to talk about these things anytime. You can find me on Twitter. It's my full name, Boris Jabes. And, you can go to getcensus.com if you want to just reach out to anyone else on our team. And you're going to find people on our team and hanging out in all the data communities. But yeah, it's love talking about this with anyone.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm sure people will take you up on that and chase you down. So Boris Jabes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And to the rest of our listeners, thanks as well for tuning in. We'll have another episode next week, May 27th. I'll be talking with Julian Ledem, the co-founder and CTO of Datakin, on the new Open Lineage project that Datakin has created. So don't miss that, as I think that'll be a great chat as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell icon so that you get notifications. And thanks again for joining.